It all started the day I came home from a fishing trip and found a bright orange sticker slapped on the windshield of my boat trailer, immediate tow notice. I was still unhooking the outboard motor when I saw her. Linda Mathers, head of the HOA board, standing across the street with her arms crossed like she was posing for a mugshot. "Boats aren't allowed in driveways, Todd," she called out, tapping her clipboard like it was a badge. "You know the rules." I wiped the salt off my brow and looked at her over the hull. "I'm well within code, Linda. The bylaws say 72 hours max." "It's been parked here since this morning." Well," she said, her voice climbing into that familiar screechy pitch. "We had a board vote last week. New amendment, no boats of any kind anytime." "Where's the notice?" I asked. She blinked, then gave a smug little shrug. "It's pending." But the board agreed unanimously. I stared at her. "You can't enforce a rule that hasn't been published. You'll want to move it," she said, ignoring me completely. "Tow truck's already been called." That's when I knew she wasn't just bluffing. I looked at the trailer hitch, still locked. No chain, no warning. She was really trying to get my boat towed right off my driveway. "You're trespassing at this point," I said, stepping between her and the trailer. Linda pulled out her phone and started dialing. "Then let's get the sheriff involved and see who they side with." I didn't wait. I walked back into the house, grabbed my phone, and made one call. "Hey, Eric," I said. "You still the harbor master down at Port River?" "Still am," he said. "Why?" "I've got an HOA lunatic trying to tow my Sea Ray off my own property. Want me to come by?" "Absolutely." 15 minutes later, Eric pulled up in his city-issued truck, stepped out in uniform, and calmly walked over to the boat. Linda was now standing even closer, barking into the phone with some poor soul from the towing company who clearly didn't want to touch this mess. Eric didn't say a word to her at first. He just walked around the trailer, pulled out a measuring tape, and checked the registration sticker. "Trailers registered, tires chalked, no overhang," he muttered. "You said this was in your driveway since this morning?" "Yeah, got in at dawn." Linda finally noticed him and snapped, "Excuse me, this is private HOA business. Who are you?" Eric stood up straight. "Harbor Master Eric Denton." "This boat's registered with the Port River Authority, and unless you're a sworn officer or have a court order, you have no authority to move a licensed vessel from private property." Linda's face drained of color like someone had pulled her plug. "But this is a violation," she said, voice cracking. "The HOA rules don't override state law," Eric cut in. "This boat is protected under maritime property regulations. If you attempt to move it without consent, that's tampering with a registered vessel. That's a felony." She opened her mouth, then shut it. The tow truck rolled up just then, but Eric waved them off with a shake of his head. "Turn around," he told the driver. "This isn't happening." The driver didn't argue. He just backed out and vanished down the street. Linda looked like she wanted to melt into the sidewalk. Her clipboard hung limp at her side. I crossed my arms. "Still want to call the sheriff." I left the boat right where it was, pulled the cover snug, and went inside. Through the blinds, I watched Linda storm off toward her car like someone had just told her the world now ran on common sense and decency. She slammed the door so hard the side mirror twitched. Then she peeled away, tires chirping. Eric stayed a few more minutes, jotting down a quick report on a yellow notepad. "You're gonna want to keep an eye out," he said, resting one arm on the trailer fender. "That woman's the type who doesn't lose well." "Yeah," I said, watching the dust settle where her car had been. "I don't think she's done." He handed me a copy of the report. "If she tries anything else, file a complaint directly with the city and reference this case number. It's official now." I nodded and thanked him. He gave me a quick pat on the shoulder and left. The next morning, I found a letter taped to my front door. Not mailed. Taped. A single sheet of paper with the HOA letterhead at the top, printed in bold red ink like it was supposed to intimidate me. It said I was being fined for creating a hostile environment and threatening a board member. It listed a total balance due of $650. I actually laughed. Then I read the fine print. "Failure to pay within 72 hours will result in lien proceedings." That stopped me cold. She wasn't just bluffing anymore. Linda was escalating. I drove straight to City Hall. I'd been a resident of Fairview Crest for over 15 years, and I knew for a fact that HOA liens had to go through municipal approval. I asked to speak to someone in zoning and community enforcement. A woman named Yvonne in a blue blazer led me into a small office with a fake ficus tree and a wall of filing cabinets. I handed her the letter. She read it once, then again, her mouth tightening. "This isn't a legal fine," she said. "HOAs can't issue penalties for vague behavioral claims. And certainly not without a hearing." "There was no hearing," I said. "She dropped this off like she was delivering pizza." Yvonne opened a drawer and pulled out a thick binder. "Let me check something." She flipped through tab sections until she landed on a page marked Fairview Crest HOA. Her finger ran down a list of approved disciplinary actions, fines for lawn violations, trash bin placement, unauthorized exterior paint. Nothing about hostile environments or threatening board members. "This isn't on their approved schedule," she said. "They're required to submit any new fine categories for municipal review before they can levy them. So if she's issuing them anyway, she's violating municipal ordinance. That's criminal fraud." I let that sink in. Yvonne tapped a few keys on her desktop. "I'm submitting a request for an audit. In the meantime, if they try to file a lien, it won't go through, not without a legal foundation." "You're safe." I thanked her and left with a copy of the ordinance she referenced, just in case. That evening, I found two more neighbors at my door, Dave from across the street and Mrs. Patel from the next cul-de-sac. "She fined me for failure to comply with community spirit," Dave said, holding up his own letter. "What does that even mean?" Mrs. Patel held hers between trembling fingers. "Mine says I demonstrated defiance. I asked her why she took down the flag bunting from my porch. We sat around my dining table swapping letters like bad trading cards. Every single one was vague, threatening, and illegal." "What's she trying to do?" Dave asked. "She's trying to scare people into paying," I said. "If she can rack up enough unpaid fines, she can start pushing for liens and foreclosures. It's a money grab." Mrs. Patel shook her head. "But why all of a sudden?" That's when I remembered something from a few months earlier. A man in a suit knocking on doors, clipboard in hand. He said he was from a development firm trying to buy up properties for a luxury remodel project. Most people turned him down, but I'd heard whispers that the HOA board was considering incentives for owners willing to sell under pressure. "She's trying to clear out holdouts," I said. "If she can fine people out of their homes, the developer gets what they want. Empty lots to rebuild." Dave cursed under his breath. "That's illegal," I nodded. "And I think we can prove it." We spent the rest of the night organizing. I pulled out a whiteboard from my garage, and we started mapping out names, dates, and letters. Dave had photos of the guy from the development firm. Mrs. Patel had saved an email from Linda mentioning partnership opportunities with outside investors. By the next morning, we had a list of 18 neighbors who'd received bogus fines, some for weeds that didn't exist, others for decorations. One guy got fined for distracting wind chimes. I made copies of everything and drove it all back to Yvonne. She looked like she'd been waiting for me. "We've had 3 more complaints since yesterday. I've escalated it." "To who?" "City Attorney's Office. They're opening a formal investigation." That night, Linda called an emergency HOA meeting. Normally, maybe 9 or 10 people showed up for those, but word had spread. The rec center was packed. Over 50 homeowners filled the chairs and more stood in the back. Linda stood at the front with her usual clipboard, flanked by 2 other board members who looked like they really didn't want to be there. "This meeting is to address recent misinformation being spread about the HOA's enforcement practices," she began. I stood up. "This isn't misinformation," I said. "It's evidence, and the city's involved now." A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Linda's eyes darted to the back of the room. I followed her line of sight and spotted someone in a dark blazer and slacks, not a resident. It was Clara Renner, assistant city attorney. She stepped forward and raised her voice. "I'm here on behalf of the city attorney's office. We've received multiple complaints regarding fraudulent fines and predatory lien threats issued by this board. Effective immediately, we are placing a hold on all enforcement actions by the Fairview Crest HOA pending a full audit." People started clapping. Dave actually whistled, Linda's face went stiff, like she was trying to blink away what was happening. "You can't just," she began. Clara cut her off. "You're not a government agency. You operate under municipal oversight, and you violated that trust." Someone from the audience shouted, "Step down." Then another, "You don't speak for this neighborhood." Linda turned to the other board members. One of them, a man named Greg who always looked like he'd rather be watching football, quietly set his clipboard on the table and walked out. I stepped forward and held up the ordinance copy Yvonne gave me. "For the record," I said, "my boat's staying right where it is. And if anyone else here received a bogus fine, I've got templates for formal complaints and legal responses. We're not backing down." The room erupted, not in chaos but in solidarity. Neighbors who barely knew each other were shaking hands, comparing notes, exchanging numbers. Linda tried to speak again, but no one was listening anymore. She finally turned, red-faced and silent, and walked out the side door. Not a single person followed her. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like it belonged to the people living in it, not the ones trying to profit from it. The following week, things didn't calm down, they intensified. With the city's audit underway and the HOA's enforcement powers suspended, the neighborhood erupted in a way I hadn't seen in the 15 years I'd lived there. People who used to wave politely and go back inside were now comparing documents on sidewalks and porches. There were impromptu meetings in driveways, a spreadsheet circulating among residents cataloging every questionable fine, and a few folks even started digging through old HOA newsletters for inconsistencies. But Linda wasn't gone. Not yet. She still held her title on paper, and she was using every minute of it. On Thursday morning, a plain white van with no markings pulled up to the south end of the neighborhood. A man in a jumpsuit walked up to Mrs. Patel's house, clipboard in hand, and started snapping photos of her garden. She spotted him from the window and came running out in slippers, demanding answers. He claimed he was documenting landscaping violations for an internal board review. That's when I started paying closer attention to the HOA's finances. I managed to get a copy of the last annual budget report. It had been buried in a members-only online portal, hidden behind a password most residents didn't even know existed. It listed the usual expenses: landscaping, pool maintenance, holiday decorations, but one section caught my eye. Consultation and external compliance services, $24,780. That wasn't just suspicious, it was absurd. I brought the document to Paul Heller, a retired forensic accountant who lived 2 streets over. Paul had worked for a state audit bureau before retiring, and he agreed to help, curious as to how a neighborhood of fewer than 200 homes could possibly need nearly $25,000 in external compliance. He spent 3 days combing through the numbers before calling me over one afternoon. "Take a look at this," he said, pointing to his laptop. I cross-referenced contractor IDs from the expense reports with the state's business registry. One of the companies listed doesn't exist. The other was dissolved last year. "So where's the money going?" He leaned back in his chair. "That's just it. There's no trail. It looks like it's being funneled through fake invoices. Someone's siphoning funds." I stared at the screen, pulse picking up. "Can we prove it?" He nodded. "We can't trace the end recipient without subpoena power, but this is enough to trigger a criminal inquiry. Especially with the city already involved." We brought the findings to Clara Renner, who had now set up a temporary office inside the old library at the edge of the neighborhood. She reviewed the data, then made 2 phone calls, one to the district attorney's office, the other to the county fraud unit. 2 days later, Linda's house was swarmed. Black SUVs rolled in at sunrise. Agents from the Financial Crimes Division of the Sheriff's Department stepped out with folders and recording equipment. A few wore windbreakers with the county seal on the back. They knocked once, announced themselves, then entered with a warrant. Word spread fast. By 8 o'clock that morning, half the neighborhood was standing on sidewalks or peering through blinds. The woman who'd once threatened fines for leaving garbage cans out for an extra hour now stood on her doorstep in a wrinkled bathrobe while officers carried out boxes of HOA documents, a desktop computer, and a printer still tangled in cables. No one said anything to her. No one needed to. But the real blow came the following Monday. The district attorney's office held a press conference on the courthouse steps. Clara stood beside them as the DA laid it all out: embezzlement, wire fraud, misuse of HOA funds, and unlawful use of authority. Linda had allegedly funneled over $50,000 in fake compliance fees into a shell company registered to a relative out of state. She'd used the money to pay off personal debts, lease a second vehicle, and most galling, fund a private membership at her resort 3 counties away. The HOA board was formally dissolved pending reorganization. Linda was arrested and charged with 5 felony counts. Everyone thought that was the end of it, but there was still the matter of the development firm. I hadn't forgotten the man in the suit who'd come around months ago. His name was Nolan Briggs. He worked for a company called Oakwell Property Group. They'd been snapping up homes in distressed neighborhoods across the state, flipping them into high-income rental properties, or leveling them entirely to build townhomes. I found his business card tucked into one of my old tool drawers. I'd taken it from him out of politeness, never intending to follow up. Now it was evidence. I brought it to Clara. Briggs visited half the homes that received illegal fines, I told her. He was targeting people under pressure. She raised an eyebrow. You think there was a connection? I don't think. I know. She added it to a file and promised to investigate. A week later, she called me back to the library office. This time, she had someone else with her, a man in a gray suit, thin and quiet, who introduced himself as Agent Morrissey from the State Attorney General's office. They'd uncovered emails. Linda had been in communication with Oakwell for over a year. She'd promised to drive down property values and soften up resistance in exchange for a personal payout and preferential terms on a future home in a different development. Briggs, it turned out, had been paying her under the table. Not just through the fake compliance fees, but in monthly cash envelopes delivered by a courier. The payments were disguised as consulting fees for community relations strategy. With that, the case went federal. Property manipulation through an HOA, conspiring to defraud residents, and coercing homeowners into selling under duress, those weren't just local crimes. They fell under the jurisdiction of the state's Real Estate Fraud Task Force. Indictments followed. Oakwell's regional office was raided. Nolan Briggs was arrested at a golf tournament in Napa. Linda, already out on bail, was rearrested and denied bond. The remaining board members, though not criminally charged, were permanently barred from holding any position of community authority. But what came next was unexpected. With the HOA legally disbanded and its charter revoked, the neighborhood faced a choice. Either reform a new board from scratch under strict city oversight, or dissolve the HOA entirely and return governance to municipal code enforcement. The vote wasn't even close. 87% of homeowners chose dissolution. For the first time in 2 decades, Fairview Crest was free from HOA control. And it showed. People started repainting their homes in colors that actually made them happy. Gardens flourished. Someone down the block even built a hand-painted wooden library box, which under the old rules would have been fined out of existence. But now, kids were trading comic books and bookmarks, and no one said a word. As for me, I took the C-Ray out every other weekend and parked it in the driveway when I got back. No more letters, no more threats, just salt air and silence. One afternoon, I saw Eric the harbor master backing into the boat ramp at the lake. I walked over and handed him a cold soda. Didn't think we'd blow the lid off a criminal enterprise when you came to stop a tow truck, I said. He grinned over his sunglasses. That's the thing about bullies. They always think the rules don't apply to them until someone reads the manual. We watched the sun dip over the water as kids splashed near the dock and a couple launched kayaks nearby. Fairview Crest wasn't perfect, but it belonged to its people again. And nobody, not a clipboard-wielding tyrant or a slick real estate broker, was going to take that from us. 2 months after the HOA board dissolved, the neighborhood was quieter, but not in the way Linda Mathers had always demanded. It wasn't the hush of fear or compliance anymore. It was the calm of people who had nothing left to hide from, no one to monitor whether their porch lights matched regulation wattage, or whether their curtains were aesthetically suitable. The only real noise came from kids playing kickball in the cul-de-sac and the occasional bark from Mr. Langley's retriever, who finally had his backyard dog run back after Linda had it dismantled for improper fencing materials. Still, not everyone had moved on. I got a call from Clara one morning as I was greasing the trailer axle. Her voice was clipped, like she was trying to keep it together. "There's something you need to see," she said. "You're listed as a primary complainant in the HOA investigation, so I can share this with you. Can you come by the municipal records office?" When I arrived, Clara was already waiting in the glass-walled conference room, a laptop open in front of her and a folder thick with printouts. She pushed one of the documents across the table. It was a permit application dated 8 months earlier. Linda's name was on it, but the applicant field listed a different name. Crescent Ridge Holdings, LLC. I frowned. "That's not the developer we dealt with before." Clara tapped the bottom right corner. "Look at the listed agent." The name was Nolan Briggs. I narrowed my eyes. So he was operating under multiple names. More than that. Crescent Ridge Holdings was created just 2 weeks before he started approaching residents here. We just connected it through a forensic audit. I leaned back. What was the permit for demolition and redevelopment? They filed a request to rezone 6 properties on this street as mixed-use housing. Townhomes and a commercial strip. My mouth went dry. There's no commercial zoning here. Exactly, but the permit was stamped as approved. I stared at her. "You're saying someone inside the city approved it," Clara nodded slowly. "We believe a former zoning officer was paid off. He retired 2 weeks after the application was pushed through." My stomach turned. So this wasn't just Linda and some fake fines. This was coordinated. "There's more," she said, clicking through to a spreadsheet. "A contractor filed a complaint 3 weeks ago, said he was hired to do a preliminary inspection of our neighborhood's underground utility lines. The work order came from Crescent Ridge. But the address listed for the inspection, it wasn't one of the 6 properties. It was the main water feed under the community center." I blinked. "Why would they care about that?" Clara didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled up a photo grainy, clearly taken from a phone. It showed the contractor's crew opening a sidewalk panel. Inside was a gas line. "They weren't inspecting water," she said. "They were mapping the gas infrastructure." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "You think they were planning something?" She nodded. "We believe they intended to cause a leak, something that would render the area unsafe, possibly trigger an evacuation. That would have allowed Crescent Ridge to buy up properties at a fraction of their value." I stared at her. "You're telling me they were going to fake a gas leak to force people out? We can't prove intent yet," she said. "But we're building a case, and we need your help." Over the next week, I worked with Clara and the DA's task force to track the timeline. We found security footage from a neighbor's camera that showed a white van parked outside the community center at 2 in the morning, 3 nights in a row. The license plate was partially obscured, but Paul, the retired accountant, ran it through a private registry database he still had access to. The van was leased to a subsidiary of Crescent Ridge Holdings. That was enough to get a warrant. The state police raided Crescent Ridge's downtown office just after dawn on a Thursday. They seized computers, contracts, and a ledger that confirmed everything. Payments to the retired zoning officer, wire transfers to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, and a calendar file titled Phase 2 Gas Utility Diversion. It was worse than we thought. They'd already hired a demolition crew. The gas leak plan was scheduled for the following month. Linda had signed off on an emergency evacuation protocol document weeks earlier. She'd even drafted letters to residents urging them to temporarily relocate for safety. The charges came fast. Linda was indicted again, this time on conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, attempted sabotage of public infrastructure, and endangerment of public safety. Briggs was hit with federal racketeering charges. 2 other executives at Crescent Ridge were detained and denied bail. But the final nail came when Agent Morrissey returned to Fairview Crest with a court order. He called a community meeting at the library, just like we'd done before. This time, though, he wasn't asking for help. He was giving us something back. The court has ruled that all properties affected by Crescent Ridge's illegal rezoning are to be restored to their original residential designation, he said, standing at the front of the room with a rolled blueprint in his hand. Furthermore, the 6 homes that were targeted for redevelopment will be granted exemption from future zoning changes for a minimum of 15 years. A cheer broke out. Kids ran down the aisle between chairs. Someone clapped me on the back and called for a neighborhood cookout that weekend. For the first time in months, it felt like we weren't just reacting anymore. We were reclaiming. After the meeting, Clara pulled me aside. "There's one more thing," she said. "We found a ledger in Linda's home. It detailed every payment she received. But next to each entry were initials. And you weren't on the list, but almost everyone else who filed complaints was. She was tracking who'd be the biggest problem if they pushed too hard." I looked out the window at the families loading into cars, kids laughing in the parking lot. "She kept tabs on who'd fight back," I said. "She underestimated who'd fight together," Clara replied. That weekend, the cookout filled the entire street. Someone grilled ribs on a smoker big enough to tow. A couple of teenagers set up a projector and played an old adventure movie on the side of a garage. Mrs. Patel made her famous mango chutney and gave everyone a jar to take home. The flags came out again, not as symbols of defiance this time, but pride, ownership, community. The HOA was gone. The developers were under investigation, and the neighborhood was finally ours again. I rolled the Sea-Ray out of the garage and parked it under the tree, not because I needed to, just because I could. And as the sun went down and the first firework popped in the sky, probably not strictly legal, but no one cared, I looked around at the people who'd stood up, spoken out, and refused to be pushed off their own land. Linda had tried to freeze me with threats, with fake rules, with force. But when Eric showed up that day on my driveway, clipboard in hand and law behind him, she realized what fear really looked like. Not the fear of a parked boat. The fear of someone who knows exactly what you're doing and isn't afraid to bring the whole house of cards down.